So this session is Climate Repair, a solutions-based approach by the IPCC. My name is Pallab Ghosh. I'm one of the BBC's science correspondents, and I've been covering climate ever since I was a science reporter, from the very first indications that there might be a problem to the crisis point we face today. For me, climate is not just the biggest story in science, it's the biggest story on the planet. And we are incredibly honoured to have the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, Dr. Hoesung Lee, to talk to us about the topic and how we should cover this hugely important issue. Dr. Lee will be giving a short presentation and then I'll have a conversation with him. But what I really want is to engage as many of you as possible, because I was just saying to Dr. Lee that this meeting is unique in having, in terms of science journalists, more experts in the audience than on stage. So over the next few minutes, I'd like to think about something you'd like to ask. You don't often get the chance to speak to the man whose job it is to save the planet. No pressure, Dr. Lee. And yes, I know you would say that your job is to help the policymakers who are saving the planet, but I think my version is snappier. And I'm not alone. Dr. Lee would be too modest to tell you that he was named by Time magazine as one of the most influential people of 2019. This is a citation for the award written by the former UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, no less. Dr. Hoesung Lee plays a vital role in supplying decision makers with the world's most authoritative scientific understanding of climate change. An academic by training and a preacher by necessity. He's a champion of climate-resilient economic development. He has made hard-hitting IPCC reports more relevant and understandable not only to policymakers but also to civil society. Last October, the IPCC's groundbreaking 1.5 degrees centigrade report, which showed that humans can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade if politicians enact measures to dramatically cut carbon dioxide emissions by 2050, made the headlines worldwide and helped convince governments to put climate action on top of their domestic agendas. But as I said, despite a long list of achievements, Dr. Lee remains a humble and modest person. His commitment not only to reduce emissions, but simultaneously increase economic opportunities and raise millions of people from poverty is one of the many reasons he is so well admired. Dr. Lee, would you come along and give us your presentation?
Thank you, Pallab, and thank you very much for the invitation to the World Conference of Science Journalists. I'm very happy to see our former IPCC chair, the chair of the third assessment, Bob Watson, is here. And the third assessment was a very important assessment in my assessment. It is the first IPCC assessment to put the climate issues on a risk management framework, and a good contribution. And Bob and I were working together as a co-chair during the second assessment report. He was co-chair of the Working Group 2, dealing with the adaptation and vulnerability, and I was co-chair of Working Group 3, dealing with socio-economic dimensions of climate change. And later he became the chair of IPCC, and I became the lead author of the IPCC Working Group 3. So, and I'm very glad to see all of you. Frankly, this is the first time to see this so many science journalists in one room. I met many journalists, but most of my meetings with journalists those are people dealing with the economics political relations, international relations, and that sort. So I'm very much looking forward to a discussion after my short remarks. The IPCC is an assessment body, is an intergovernmental body consisting of 195 member governments. And we do not do original research. We assess the existing literature to inform policy makers, which is our core audience. And we convey what we know and what we do not know. And then we also communicate to the scientific community where further research is needed. Many commentators indicated that the IPCC peer review process is probably one of the most rigorous peer review process. And it has been that way since the first assessment report. And we are very much keen on maintaining that rigorousness in our review process, which is the only way to enhance the objectivity and comprehensiveness of our report. Needless to say, you media are the indispensable for our work, and because the findings of our work have to be communicated to not only to the decision makers, but also to many stakeholders around the world, and you are the key ingredient connecting us to the outside world. Let me just briefly mention what we plan to do in our current assessment, which is known as AR6. The latest one was the special report on 1.5, and the key messages that have been well known that climate change, its impacts occurring already, and its scope and speed much faster than we have understood so far. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, according to our assessment, is not impossible, but would require unprecedented efforts in all segments of the society. I'll probably tell more about this during our conversation. And there are clear benefits to keeping warming well below 2 degrees or something close to 1.5 degrees compared to other climate goals. Those potential benefits have not been well communicated to the world in general. And limiting warming to 1.5 degrees can go in hand with societal's aspiration for achieving a sustainable development, as well as aspiration to eradicate poverty. In fact, when the UNFCCC under the Paris Agreement invited IPCC to do a special report on 1.5, their request focused on two elements. What is mitigation pathways compatible to achieving limiting warming to 1.5, and the other is what would be the impact under that 1.5 warming. And IPCC plenary meetings, while accepting that invitation, at the same time added one phrase indicating that this special report will be accomplished in the context of sustainable development and also in the context of eradication of poverty. So this sustainable development is a key overarching concept that this special report 1.5 has been conducted. In fact, this sustainable development will be a key framework that all our reports under this cycle will be conducted. The key messages of this special report 1.5 is that given this very ambitious goal of limiting warming to 1.5, we need action immediately, and every action matters, and time is of essence. Just a couple of months ago, we also released one of the key messages, that is the methodology report that is with how the parties to the UNFCCC report on their emissions and removal by sinks on a methodology based upon the latest science. It is a very important input to this negotiation process because this report provides a transparency for the countries' communications of their inventory of emissions and removals. Very soon we will be releasing another special report that is about land, climate change and land. And you can find the outline of that report on our website. And it is a very complicated subject. And let me just read you the full title of this report. The Climate Change and Land, an IPCC Special Report on Climate Change, Desertification, Land Degradation, Sustainable Land Management, Food Security, Greenhouse Gas Fluxes, and Terrestrial Ecosystems. This is the title of this report. And in fact, every chapter of this report will deal with these topics. This will consider the land-based mitigation and of adaptation to climate change. Also, it is covering the land-climate interactions and food systems and other linkages to the sustainable development. And then September, we will release the special report on oceans and cryosphere in a changing climate. That's the title of the report. And it covers what's happening to the ocean and the frozen world in the past, now, and what we expect to happen in those climate systems. Very important for us to deepen our understanding of these two very important climate systems under the stress of the climate change, as well as how those will affect the livelihoods along the livelihoods in the human system along the coast. 2021, we will finalize all three working group reports, and then year after, we will finish a synthesis report. The synthesis report is the integrated report of all three working groups, as well as all three special reports, including the methodology reports. And the timing of the release of the special report, synthesis report, is 2022. That was just scheduled to provide scientific inputs to the policymakers coming to the what's known as global stocktake that will take place in 2023. As I said before, all our efforts to produce an 8 report during this cycle is anchored on this concept of achieving sustainable development, not only to support the specific UN goals of Agenda 2030, but also to improve our understanding, to deepen our understanding about the relation between climate change and sustainable development, as well as relation between climate change and economic development. So that's our goal, to produce all these special and regular working group reports for the decision makers, for them to have a intelligent as well as insightful decisions for the planet. Thank you very much. Let me finish at this point, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Take one of these microphones. So, Dr. Lee, thanks to you and your predecessors, climate change is now very much on the top of agendas of government. But it seems like we're running out of time. You did present a very hopeful report last October saying that 1.5 degrees centigrade, that's not doing too much damage to the planet, is feasible. You've got the Paris Agreement to try and get us to that point. How likely do you think that is to happen? It's on.
So the question is, do you think the 1.5 climate goal be achievable? Is that the
That's right.
point of the question? Well, in fact, whether such a goal to be feasible or not was the question that we faced right from the first day of the scoping of this report. And the scoping usually begins about a year before the actual writing of the report. And feasibility was not the question of feasibility was not the first time that was presented to us with regard to this 1.5. And in fact, during AR5, when we analyzed and assessed the various options for 2.0, the feasibility, again, was one of the main items that we had to grapple with. And what we found is this: there are various dimensions to understand the feasibility. Obviously, there's economic dimensions for feasibility, and there's the technological or technical dimensions feasibility, and then there are social dimensions of technical feasibility. And what we found was that when we understand the feasibility in terms of the aggregateness of this impact, then we may say something about what certain pathways can be feasible or not. And AR5, at the conclusion of AR5, what we found was that we do have tremendous understanding about the technological feasibility of the specific pathways. At the same time, also, we do have a reasonably good understanding about the economic feasibility of various options. But we said that our understanding about the social aspect of feasibility of various options and mitigation pathways, there are lots of rooms to improve. And when we studied...
So when you say social aspects, are you being polite and trying not to refer to politicians and certain countries not committing properly?
Well, the feasibility in the end depends upon how the society accepts consequences of certain decisions. And invariably, we found that one of those important consequences is a distributional aspect of policy change or new options that society has to adopt. And now, this distributional consequences of certain options or other consequences or societal aspects of consequences belong to the area of value judgment. And it is a very important topic for consideration, but at that time, our understanding of that issue were rather limited on the basis of available literatures. And so the same question still remains now. And,
So I wasn't sure if that was yes or no as to whether you think that 2 degrees was... But anyway, I won't press you on that. One of the things that I'd imagine is emerging from future reports is more emphasis on solutions. Elaborate on that more, but specifically I wanted to ask you what you thought of this emerging idea of climate repair, ideas to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, possibly refreezing the poles, ideas that were dismissed as a distraction, but possibly now regarded as essential given the rate at which we're going.
I think this question is related to the first question, and in terms of the technology development, may I say that the direction, you are the science journalist, and the overall direction of technology development is in favor of reducing carbon emissions. And in terms of finance, I met a number of people in those areas. The somewhat, let's say, unanimous assessment is that there's no shortage of global savings, but there's a shortage of investable, bankable projects. That's what I heard. So technology is on our side, and finance is on our side, and what's the area that we need to further to have is the enabling the conditions in the policy arena. And so there are a number of policy options that countries can pursue, and I don't have to elaborate any one of these at this point, but you may ask that later. Okay, so that's my assessment. Now, with regard to those various technologies you mentioned about the carbon dioxide removal and the other methods, our upcoming assessment will analyze those options. In AR5, we did not analyze those options because at that time the literature base was rather slim, so we deferred those assessments to the current cycle.
Will you also be putting more emphasis on perhaps some of the social sciences, because key to all of this is behavior change?
Yes, and I said just a few minutes ago that it was very difficult for us to understand properly the societal aspect of this feasibility questions. It related to also on the behavioral aspect. And what our study on our report on 1.5 indicate is, I think the most important message from this 1.5 is that we need to have a vastly different economy, which is a much more efficient, energy efficient economy and much more resource efficient economy. And now this is based upon existing literatures, and we found that there are a number of technological options to improve the energy productivity, a number of technological options available to improve to reduce the resource footprint for the production process. And now what remains to be asked is how those energy efficient and resource efficient economy can be transmitted to the level of consumption and level of the behavioral individual decisions regarding personal choices and regarding the preferences for the daily life. And there we noticed the importance of infrastructure. And a lot of Europe, may I say Europe, the preference and Europe, the choices for consumption and my choices for consumption and behavior, we found depends upon the availability of infrastructure. Let me give you an example. I live in a city where the availability of mass transportation system is quite good. So I have the choice of walking and using mass transit every day.
And suppose I live in a different parts of the country and different country in other segment of the world, then I may not have that luxury of the choices that I choose which transportation mode I will take. Now, so this infrastructure decision is requiring somewhat coordinated effort by the public sector as well as the private sector. And because infrastructure investment requires a long lead time, and you need a very well organized and strategized infrastructure plan, so that you will have a choice to enjoy your consumption with much less a carbon footprint. And in fact, talking of infrastructure, I may say that our data indicate that the infrastructure stock per capita in the developing world is about 20% of the developed world. So developing world will continue to invest on this infrastructure. And imagine if they are able to fill this infrastructure gap with a zero carbon technologies, then the world will be in pretty good shape. And
what about personal choices? Will your land use report look at diet? Because one of the biggest things that we could all do is eat less meat. Will the IPCC explore those choices?
Yes, and IPCC does not deal with what sort of food one must eat, and that's not our area to say anything. But I can say this: food waste. I believe it is a World Food Organization, Agricultural Organization, FAO. It's calculated the carbon footprint of the food waste, and they reported that in terms of carbon emissions, if waste is thought as a country, then it will be third largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. I don't have to say which one is first and second. So there is a great deal that consumer, you and I, can do to have impact on reducing carbon footprint of the consumption. There are a number of examples that one can think of managing or reducing carbon footprint of consumption. Now, data shows that the developing countries are continuing increase their carbon emissions throughout, and then also the indication is that the carbon emissions from developing countries will increase, and whereas the carbon emissions in developed countries stagnate or decline. But if you consider the carbon emissions embedded in consumption, much of the consumption in the developed world is an imported consumption. That portion has a carbon content, although that carbon was not emitted in the developed world, but emitted in the developing world. So there's some amount of rigorous thinking when we consider a level of consumption. At the same time, we consider a level of production in terms of understanding the total carbon emission.
Now, as I said, I do want to hand it over to you as soon as possible, but one last question from me at this stage. The IPCC has been quoted as saying there's 12 years to save the world, and I know that's a misquote, but how dire, how urgent is the situation for our generation to make a difference? Is it now or never?
Well, global peaking of carbon dioxide has to happen as soon as possible, probably yesterday. But that's according to the Paris Agreement. Now, 2030 is a number mentioned in the Paris Agreement. Obviously, it was mentioned in our study, but mentioned in Paris Agreement. Let me give you an example. I believe it is Decision 17, Paris Agreement. It says that the countries will need to achieve this aspiration. And then it specifically said that NDCs currently indicates a 55 gigaton of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And then it says that according to the IPCC AR5, the level of emissions that will be consistent with 2 degree will be 40 gigaton of emissions. And then the last sentence says that we need to have a level of emissions that is comparable to 1.5 degrees. That quantity will be provided by the IPCC. So 2030 was the number in the Paris Agreement, and then you may question why that, from what source the Paris Agreement got that 2030. Well, that 2030, origin of 2030 was our AR5. And our AR5 analyzed the various mitigation pathways for 2 degrees. And the key message was that by the second half of the century, we need to have carbon neutrality. But at the same time, we found the need to convey the message that to achieve that, we need to have a action for a very immediate periods. And we picked 2030 to convey the message that achieving carbon neutrality by the second half of the century, we need to have at least this much of a 40 gigaton of the carbon emissions, not to be exceeded by 2030. So that's the origin of 2030. Now, I can say that the key number, if you wish to remember, is 2 things, I believe. One is 2050. That's the year that carbon neutrality has to be achieved. The other number is, may I say 2020, because we need to achieve this peaking of carbon emissions as soon as possible. So those 2 numbers are there.
Well, thank you. As I say, this is your opportunity to ask questions to Dr. Lee, ask him how you should be covering science, and also to share your own perspectives. The first person I'd like to ask is one of your predecessors, Professor Bob Watson, a former chair of the IPCC. Bob, how's Dr. Lee doing, in your judgment? But also, more seriously, what are your observations about whether we're going to hit the 2-degree target, and what you think of, I mean, I know you're a bit diplomatic and a bit backward in coming forward with these things, but your observations on what governments are or are not doing to try and save the planet.
Well, Dr. Lee is doing almost as well as me, but no, he's doing an excellent job, and I liked actually all of his answers to your questions. However, I would be probably slightly more blunt. I think the chances of hitting 1.5 are basically 0. The technical report was very good. It did a good technical analysis, a good economic analysis, but if you look around the world, what's happening socio-politically, in some cases, we're going backwards in some countries, like in the USA, Brazil with its potential increase in deforestation. I think the chances of making a 2-degree world are also fairly low. I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation that was printed, and the numbers were confirmed basically by IPCC IPCC with a much more sophisticated assessment. That is, we will probably go beyond 1.5 as early as in the early 2030s, and IPCC said 2030 to 2050. I think it's more likely to be in the 2030s. We'll go past 1.5, and IPCC, in the simple analysis I did, is we potentially go past 2 in around 2060. So it's very clear, without additional, so if with the current pledges, even if all the current pledges are met, it puts us on a pathway to 3.5 degrees Celsius. To be on a pathway to 2, which is technically feasible, I agree completely with the IPCC report, it would mean most countries would have to double or triple their effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and certainly the industrialized world has to be almost close to zero emissions by 2050, basically, to allow some emissions from developing countries. So I think we've got a monstrous challenge in front of us, and the only thing I would say compared to your opening statement, I believe 2 issues are co-equally important for the world to address: climate change and biodiversity together. They're totally intertwined. They both threaten food security, water security, human health, economic development, and if the goal of the UN Sustainable Development Goals is leave nobody behind, which I really like, unfortunately both climate change and loss of biodiversity hurt the poorest people in the poorest country, so it's a moral and ethical and equity issue. So I like very much all of Dr. Lee's answers to your questions. I would just be a little bit more blunt, and I think we are not on a pathway to 1.5 or 2, and I think we're going to have to double and redouble our efforts even to get close to 2 degrees Celsius.
So for more fireworks, Bob's going to give a plenary tomorrow at 5 o'clock, so be sure to come along to that. What are your observations on what Bob has said?
I agree, and especially as I mentioned, you also mentioned those lack of political will. It seems that.
So you agree that we're not going to hit 1.5 or 2, and we're on a course for 3.5?
I agree with Bob Watson's assessment of Bob Watson's concern about the feasibility of 1.5, and with regard to whether we will achieve that 1.5 or 2, it's up to each scientist's analysis and judgment. I myself, I think of 2 factors. One is we are talking about technology and economic systems for years to come, something like for the short term, for 2 decades from now on. Frankly, I do not know what type of technologies the society will be using within the next 2 decades. And for the societal attitudes toward the various politics and other concerns of the society, I cannot imagine what sort of societal arrangement we will live within the next 2 decades. And if we go back 2 decades from now, and could I imagine that the world in 2019 we would have considered the self-driving cars, just one example, and lots of societal changes have happened, unprecedented happened, and I believe that sort of unprecedented societal technological change will happen within the next 2 decades, and so my point is that fortunately those changes are not in favor of increasing carbon intensity. That is a message of hope I wish to convey.
Well, we do need hope. So over to you. What I plan to do is to take a range of questions or observations, and then we'll have a chat about that, and then back and forth. There are 2 microphone holders, so try and attract their attention. And to the microphone holders, if you could just get 4 people just to make their questions or points, one after each other. So perhaps starting on this side.
First one here.
Hello, I am Olivier Abalin. I come from France, where I co-chair a master degree on climate and medias, where we try to get journalists, but French-speaking journalists, formed to speak about climate change. And what we see is that French journalists lack, but not scientific journalists, of course, but French journalists in general lack informations and are not relevant when they talk about climate change. Don't you think here that it would be good for IPCC maybe to provide some education to journalists in some modules, so that maybe English-speaking journalists would be able to speak about climate change, giving solutions or good indications for readers to take this problem themselves. My initial question was that you make a tremendous work and a lot of reports are being made now, but are you sure that a lot of readers are reading them?
Thank you, Olivier. What I'd say is that perhaps that's more the job of organisations like the World Federation of Science Journalists, and I think we are planning to do that. And what I'd say as a journalist is that the IPCC reports are incredibly easy to read. A lot of effort does go into making them accessible, but perhaps more work could be done on translation. So another observation before we come, 2 more observations before we come to Professor Lee.
Hello, my name is Michelle Soto from Costa Rica. We were talking about how the social context is so important for climate action. So my question is the AR6 going to include social sciences this time? And by social sciences, I'm not only talking about economics. I'm only talking about anthropology, sociology, even psychology, because there's a post-traumatic impact after natural disasters, for example. So that's my question. Thank you.
So, thank you. Another one on this side.
Yeah, hello, Dr. Lee. My name is Marcel Henke. I'm a journalist from Switzerland. I wanted to ask you, well, there is the slogan of the Climate Friday for Future movement. We need systems change, not climate change. The IPCC 1.5 special report says that we need far-reaching system transitions in all fields, unprecedented in scale. I know the sentence by heart, but I don't know exactly what you mean or what the IPCC means by system change. Does it mean a change of technological systems, of political systems? Is it about capitalism, or what does it mean?
Great. And just another one on this side, if there is one. I don't...
Thank you. I haven't got on a plane in about 5 years because I'm worried about climate change. Do you think that I have done anything to help help solve climate change by doing that?
So, sorry, you don't say...
I haven't got on a plane for 5 years. Or do you think that is... do you think that I'm doing anything to help or not?
Okay, so the questions are, could you make your, take them in any order you want, but just to summarise, Olivier asked if you could do more to educate journalists. There was a question on whether social sciences, like anthropology, will be part of the next report. What you mean by a change in system, and that lady's question as to how much good has she done by not going on a plane for 5 years.
Thank you. These are really the thought-provoking questions. Now, educate. Why don't the IPCC educate journalists? Well, that is a rather daunting question. We hope journalists educate scientists regarding the proper way of communicating our findings. And a much more professional answer can be given by our communication head, which is sitting in the second row of here. Okay. And I understand that our findings need to be conveyed in a correct way to the stakeholders around the world, and your role will be very critical. And our communications office has a number of, I'd say, programs to improve on that regard. With regard to the contribution by social sciences, including disciplines other than economics, yes, it's a very, very valid, relevant point. And if you remember the one graph of Special Report 1.5, to achieve that 1.5, we need to have this inverted U-shape pathways. And whole issue of AR6 is to how to achieve this downward sloping curve of the mitigation pathways. The IPCC, for the last 30 years, under the leadership of Bob Watson, has been working very hard to understand this upward sloping of the pathway, emissions pathways. Now, this AR6 is to deepen our understanding about how to make society achieve this downward sloping of the pathways. Now, that requires contributions by social scientists because it is a break away from the system we have known so far. And the system, there's a question about what system that we are talking about. We are not talking about changing the capitalist system. And we are talking about the energy system, transformation of energy system, and transition away from currently the carbon-intensive energy system. The options for the airplane travel, well, I can say two things. A number of IPCC meetings have been held electronically in order to minimize carbon footprint. And then technologically, there are a segment of the people that are working hard on developing the alternative fuels for the air transportation, and including the electric airplanes, and certainly the biofuel for the electric biofuel for the airplane. In fact, the transportation is one of the difficult, challenging area to achieve a decarbonization. So we recognize the difficulties, and that there are other segment of the industry that gives us the challenge to achieve that decarbonization.
And there was I think that was all of them. So there was a gentleman in the middle, and if we can, after that, go to someone over here.
Thanks very much, Dr. Lee. My name is Richard Klein, long-time IPCC author, Working Group 2. It's clear from your presentation and also from the discussion following that the IPCC is very keen to convey a message of hope, an optimistic message. At the same time, as we've heard from Bob Watson, things are quite critical. Do you think there'll ever be a point that the IPCC's key message will be, I'm sorry, it's too late? We can no longer control climate change. There's a high risk of all sorts of nonlinear change. Instead of talking about repairing the climate, we'll need to talk about repairing the damage that climate change is doing.
Okay.
Well, I would like to add My name is Satish Joshi. I'm Indo-Swiss. And I would like to say it more clearly that don't you think that the technology and the finance are not the basic questions, it's a behavior, as Pallab Ghosh said. And behavior, your behavior and my behavior is based on your culture and my culture. And one of the factors of culture behavior is the religion. So don't you think that IPCC should think in this term to get the real results rather than beating around the bush?
Withdrawing carbon from the atmosphere sounds like the most painless of solutions, and yet we don't hear much about that. What makes it such a daunting challenge? Why is that such a hard mountain to climb?
And I'll take one more perhaps from that side.
Dr. Lee, you said earlier that climate change was happening faster than you thought before. So what are the two main areas that worry you in terms of things that are not yet understood in terms of feedback loops in the Arctic or elsewhere? And the other question, if I may, is what about soil as a carbon sequestration mechanism?
Okay, so go ahead.
Regarding the first question about whether we should confess the dire consequences of the lack of action, well, I think a lot depends upon the political will, and we do not understand, do not know what determines the political will. Many times one detects the disconnect between science and action. The political will has always been attributed as a element that explains that gap. Certainly, there are many elements determining the outcome of the political will, and we believe that the cost effectiveness is one of those elements. And the cost effectiveness is the one metric that IPCC has been working so many years. But we do not know what other dimensions of elements there are to determine the political will. So I think there's clearly a scientific questions to be addressed about this political will. And so I'm not sure whether our current assessment will be able to deal with that, but depends upon the availability of the literature regarding that. And whether the question of it's too late to achieve 2 or too late to achieve 1.5. There are two elements. One is the geophysical constraint, and Dr. Watson mentioned 2030, 2040. That's the period that 1.5 will be. We will achieve that point. Now that's the geophysical constraints that we cannot do anything about it. And now then there are other elements with regard to the adaptation. That depends upon, that requires understanding about the socioeconomic changes, socioeconomic development. And we should be able to minimize the devastating effects of that rising temperature, depending upon our capability of adapting to this changing climates. Again, there's a certain limit to that adaptation, which is known as limit to adaptation. And that limit to adaptation consists of two factors. One is geophysical factor, the other is socioeconomic factors. And behavior, importance behavior, we do agree that very much. And in fact, our working group 3 in the ongoing assessment deals with this particular aspect of the decision making in one dedicated chapter. The name of the title of the chapter is written as somewhat mundane, as demand for the energy, something like that. But bullets explaining that demand is all about the consumer preference and behavior. Now, with regard to behavior, I mentioned about the importance of infrastructure, and we regard the behavioral change from two aspects. One is economic aspects, and the other is non-economic aspects. And you mentioned really the importance of non-economic aspects. We recognize that. And to deepen our understanding of that element's non-economic effects, we do need the contribution by anthropologists, psychologists, and other realms of social science. And CDR, why is it so difficult? Because it is untested, and best well-known technology is the BECS, the bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and it is untested. And generally, the 1.5 study indicates that in terms of per ton of carbon removed, BECS will cost about $200. Whereas the planting trees, which is the simple one, will cost about $50 per ton of carbon removed. What important changes in the climate system or ecosystem changes that makes me worry after this release of 1.5? Well, our study, this special report, indicated three very important elements in the ecosystem. One is biodiversity, and this special report found that the negative impact on biodiversity was much greater than we had understood so far. And second one is the coral reefs. And you probably have heard many times about this devastating impact on coral reefs in the current warming of 1.5 degrees, and the study indicates that even a additional 0.5 degree warming, the coral reefs, the damage to coral reefs will be substantial. And the other one is the Arctic, and 1.5 degree means that's the average. And so the Arctic warming in Arctic will be much, much higher than 1.5. And currently, some regions in Arctic, even under global average of 1.5 warming, reports something close to 3 degrees warming in the Arctic area. So those are the important changes that the study assessment have observed. And then there's another one, that's the trigger threshold. The special report found that the instability of the ice sheet in the Greenland and also Antarctica may be triggered somewhere between 1.5 and 2. And our previous understanding is that the trigger may be the threshold may be crossed somewhere above 2 degrees, but this time we found that it will be much less than 2 degrees. So that's one major the findings. And obviously that instability of the ice sheet in Greenland and Antarctica will have a tremendous impact. You know all of those in terms of sea level rise for the centuries to come. So.
Well, Dr. Lee, thank you, and I'm afraid we've run out of time. But thank you so much for being here. I don't know if you've got time to go downstairs and have a drink and perhaps answer some of the questions from people that weren't able to ask them. But I suppose what I would say is to pay tribute to the IPCC and all the people that have worked here, including the leaders, because although on the one hand it's a message of worry and despair, you're the people that are painstakingly collecting the data, providing the evidence, and giving us a chance to do something. I think that's important. And I said this at the previous session, and I don't apologise for saying it. Given the critical nature of the situation, I'm reminded of a wartime propaganda poster of a child sitting at her father's knee, asking him what he did during the war, and him feeling ashamed that he did nothing. I think we will have a similar conversation with our children and grandchildren who will ask us what we did to combat climate change. And I think we can take individual actions and we can take actions through our work. Clearly, yourself and Bob Watson are leaders in this, but I think as a community of science journalists, we have a role as well. Personally, I don't think we should campaign. Those of you who are campaigners, you should, but I think that we should report it clearly and accurately. And even though there is fake news, let's just make sure that we do our bit to make sure that people have the information to make the choices they need, so that we can give a positive answer to our children and grandchildren. So thank you all very much. Drinks free.